if you were to try to characterize the speakers here at CPAK, I think one of the words you would use would be heretics, because, you know, they're stepping on sacred beliefs like art. You know, they're stepping on those answers that have gotten in the way of the questions. And yet, you know what the word heretic literally means in Greek? It means one who is able to choose. A heretic is one who is able to choose, and it's the same root as the word hero. That's what you're hearing here, is cutting edge stuff. People who are messing with sacred cows, right? You know, hundreds of thousands of years of beliefs, but those are lower age beliefs if we understand the cycle, right? So now we're coming into a more heroic age. That's the next age. It's going to be much more conscious, and don't you see that happening around the world with all the diversity of thinking, with all the sharing of all these diverse messages, you know? It's unbelievable the way it's all coming together. And those sponsors of the Bent Pyramid Project, you know, they're from all over the world. And so it's, I think, a very hopeful sign. So our next speaker, Andrew Collins, is going to be talking to us about the Genesis of Cosmology. And this goes way back too. And he's talking about the founders of Göbekli Tepe that Dr. Schock was talking about. Who were these people? Why did they do all of this? And not to always go back to Yogananda, but he was so dominant in my education in all of this. One time he said, thousands of civilizations have been destroyed tracelessly, right? With all these world upheavals and ice ages that happen. And like Dr. Schock was saying, it can happen so fast via solar flares or whatever. And like they found woolly mammoths that have died and been flash frozen with undigested grass in their stomachs, right? It can happen fast. And so who knows what global warming is all about? I don't understand the science behind it or anything, but it's like change is the name of the game. And from the yogic tradition, and purportedly the Hindu scriptures, the oldest written records in the world, and for thousands of years before that, they didn't write it down because they knew it would be mistranslated in the lower ages. You know, they talk about the idea of detachment being the key watchword, being a watcher, a witness of this drama, because change is the name of the game, and we're looking for changelessness, right? And so what is that? Going within, where those eternal things never change, you know, and we can relax. So, Andrew, are you ready for rock and roll?
Give us 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Take a deep breath. In fact, stand up. It's an incredible amount of digestion we have to do when we come here, isn't it? I sit in the back and take notes through it all because I know I can't process it in real time.
Right. Can you just do a test on there? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah?
Okay.
Right.
Andrew Collins, and away we go.
Right, okay. Thank you for all of the other speakers. I'm the last one of the day, and I have to speak at double speed. So if I make sweeping statements which are not backed up with lots of evidence, don't worry about it, talk to me outside. Because we've only got 50 minutes to do a lecture, which in theory is a lot longer. So without further ado, my name's Andrew Collins, I come from England, I write books, and I'm going to talk to you about people called the Denisovans today. That's how they pronounced, Denisovans. And we will start at Göbekli Tepe, somewhere that the other speakers have talked about today, somewhere that's incredibly enigmatic. But the big question is, why was it actually built? It was constructed for the first time in around 9,600 BC. And that corresponds precisely to the end of a 1,200-year period of terrifying activity in the world known as the Younger Dryas impact event. It's something that's now absolutely mainstream, and I think that if anybody denies it these days, then they're sticking their head in the sand and just ignoring the obvious evidence that there was a massive comet impact, and it took 1,200 years for everything to settle. And that brings us to 9,600 BC, which is exactly when the earliest and most sophisticated temples were constructed at Göbekli Tepe. And there is very clear comet imagery at Göbekli Tepe suggesting that there is a relationship, a connection with this event. You can see here the belt of a pillar, number 18 in enclosure D, the oldest, the most sophisticated of the structures. There is a belt buckle at the front of this belt. There are various other symbols, and I believe very strongly that it represents a three-tailed comet, which you can see here to the right. And to back up this connection with comet imagery is the fact that directly below this comet symbol is a fox pelt. A fox is one of the most prominent symbols on the carved stones at Göbekli Tepe. It's a universal symbol of comets and comet tails. Canines, wolves, foxes, coyote were all seen as tricksters that could rock the pole that supported the world and create absolute destruction. And the supernatural creatures that were seen to be associated with the appearance of comets in the sky had to be appeased. And that this is something that the shamans would intervene with and go into the sky world and try and connect with the supernatural creatures, mostly of a canine nature, and try to convince them not to destroy the world, as they nearly did with the Younger Dryas impact event. But the question becomes, where exactly was this sky world that they would reach to try and deal with these supernatural creatures? Well, this is enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. It has the most beautiful geometry, which you can see here. And all the evidence suggests that it's aligned towards the north-northwest through a hold stone that you can see here in colour on the right, which is either a symbolic or an actual pointer towards the horizon. And if we look towards the horizon at that exact point, when this enclosure was constructed in 9,600 BC, what do we see? The answer is the setting of a bright star in the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird. Normally, this constellation is seen as a swan, but in many other parts of the world, it is other types of birds. For instance, in the Near East, in Greece, and in Armenia, even in today, it's a vulture. The vulture was the ultimate symbol of death and rebirth amongst the Neolithic peoples of Göbekli Tepe and other early Neolithic structures and complexes like Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey. Obviously, Göbekli Tepe itself is in southeast Anatolia or Turkey. Now, there are a great many sites around the world orientated towards stars, and many of those sites are orientated towards Cygnus. We'll try and understand why. For instance, this is the Temple of the Foliate Cross at Palenque in the Yucatan. Well, it's actually just off the Yucatan, but it's a Maya complex, and it is orientated towards the setting of that same star. So it's exactly the same orientation as at least 3 or 4 of the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, all of which face towards the setting of Deneb at the time of the construction of the monuments. Now, when I worked out the connection with Cygnus to do with these enclosures and its association with the vulture, one stone had not been found, and this is one which Alistair talked about earlier, which is known as the Vulture stone, pillar 43 in enclosure D. It's just to the left of that hold stone that I pointed out earlier on. And by the way, it's the axis of these structures that seem to be focused towards the north-northwest and the setting of this particular star. So there are various different interpretations, as Alistair said, to do with the Vulture stone. However, what we do know is that the scorpion almost certainly represents Scorpius. It's probably one of the earliest representations, if not the oldest representation, of the constellation, or the zodiacal constellation of Scorpius. And it was suggested a long while ago by some Armenian researchers that the vulture that's actually seen on the stone is Cygnus. This was nothing to do with me. But my colleague Rodney Howe, an engineer, has worked out, I think, very precisely what the Vulture stone represents. And if we see the head of the stone as representing the horizon up to the sky, and the stem of the stone actually representing the underworld, and the line between them representing the horizon, everything works out perfectly if you orientate the ball that is seen on the wing of the vulture. If that becomes the northern celestial pole, the turning point of the heavens, everything synchronizes together. The vulture becomes the constellation of Cygnus. The scorpion is exactly as it should be as Scorpius, and it's rising up from the underworld towards the vulture itself, and the whole represented by this ball on the top of the vulture is the so-called hole in the sky that in many shamanic traditions, particularly in Central Asia and in Siberia, is the entrance point into the sky world. In other words, the vulture seems to be protecting or guarding this entrance into the sky world, as if you almost have to go through this vulture to reach it. And this vulture we now know represents Cygnus. Why are we talking about birds? Because birds are the symbol of the soul in an astral form. When we die, whether it be in actuality or within a shamanic death trance, it was seen, and still is in many cultures today, that the soul takes the form of a bird to move from this world to the next. And this is the reason why these birds are so important to this story. Cygnus was seen as a primal cause, a place of origin of life and the universe in many different cultures around the world. As I said, mostly it's seen as a swan, but there are various other birds involved. In Egypt, Cygnus was the goose, Gengenwur, the great cackler that gives out this honk to create the universe and bring the world into being. He was an avatar of the god Geb. In Hindu and in Vedic tradition, it was the swan goose Hamsa, a form of Brahma that brought the universe into being by also giving out a divine call that resonates and creates the physical universe. In Hungary, the queen of the fairies, Ilona, took the form of a swan to give birth to an egg that becomes the sun. And although this is a Hungarian tradition, it is of what's known as Finno-Ugric origin. In other words, it comes from the area of the Ural Mountains, from the peoples there that gradually moved westwards into northern and into various other parts of Middle Europe. And it seems to be associated with the Milky Way. The Milky Way was seen as a symbolic path along which birds, particularly swans and geese, flew in their migrations north and south each summer and winter. And this was personified in many places across Europe as a goddess. Her name in Estonia and Finland, for instance, is Linda. And it was seen that the trail of her hair, or even the wedding dress, created the Milky Way, along which these migrating birds were able to travel. And not only was this a physical thing, but the birds were going into the sky world itself, what they called the birdland. And this, when mentioned as far as the direction, was always in the north. and it would seem to be associated with the stars of the north, in particular, quite obviously, Cygnus. And this is brought out by the fact that the Queen of the Fairies in Hungarian tradition, whose name is Ilona, her home in the sky was called the Turning of the Fairies. And it was located very specifically in the position where the Milky Way splits in two. It forks. And the star that marks that is Deneb in Cygnus. That was her home. So in other words, she gives birth to the sun from that position. She was also seen as the genetrix, the progenitor of the human race as well, which is also very interesting. Alistair talked earlier about Lascaux in the Dordogne region of France, and this was interpreted by Michael Rappengluck of the University of Munich as representing the area of sky involving Cygnus and the other stars around it. The bird on the pole represents, the bird itself is Cygnus. The pole is the connecting point, the axis mundi that links this world to the turning point of the sky. And at the top of that pile, at the time when these images were created in somewhere called the Shaft of the Dead Man, in Lascaux Cave, was the stars of Cygnus. Cygnus represented the point in the sky around which all the other stars turned at that point. It doesn't anymore because of precession, something that obviously we learn a lot about at this conference, because the slow wobble of the Earth over a 26,000 year period changes the pole star. But in 16,000 BC, when these images were created, the stars of Cygnus represented that point, and with it, of course, the Milky Way. The Milky Way was seen to turn like a propeller around the central point every night, and once every night it would also line up perfectly north-south, something it doesn't do today. It would have been an incredibly spectacular sight, and confirmation that this imagery of the birdman and the bird on the pole, by the way, the birdman is almost certainly a shaman in a death trance, falling backwards out of this world into the next, is that the Shaft of the Dead Man is this strange circular pit, and the actual symbolism that's on the wall, the art itself, faces towards the north. It's almost as if it's an invisible window through into the northern sky where those exact stars were at that point. So, you know, it was like almost like a sort of Paleolithic planetarium in a way. And this idea of Cygnus being the turning point of the heavens and also the point of first creation is not just found on the Eurasian continent, it's also found in Africa, it's in South America, but it's also in North America. The bird of creation, for instance, in Cherokee tradition is Guisgui, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, and it sits at the access point of heaven, and it is identified with the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. And then we come to the Native American death journey, which is now generally referred to as the path of souls. One of the reasons why birds were so associated with the Milky Way is because it was seen that these birds, particularly swans and geese, were carrying the souls of those who had died into the afterlife. And this is something that's universal. It's in the Eurasian continent, it's in the Americas, and in the Americas there are up to 30 to 40 different First Nations who, and backed up with art from much earlier periods, the Mississippian period, that talk about this universal death journey. And it's a death journey that begins with either the physical death of a person or that of the shaman, because remember, when shamans go into death trances, they are believed to die in this world, and in some cases they do actually die because of the hallucinogens, whatever they're doing, could actually kill them. And in that state they go to the same place that a soul goes at the point of real death, and that is the afterlife. That afterlife is in the sky, and it would seem to be associated very strongly with two constellations, and possibly three. And those constellations are these, because the soul was seen to take a leap of faith towards the horizon And where there, they would leap onto the Milky Way at one of two places, both of which are very close together, and the option was there. One was the Orion constellation, and the other was the star cluster of the Pleiades. Different tribes had different traditions, but they represent the point where the ecliptic crosses the Milky Way at one of 2 points in the sky. The other side is Sagittarius and Scorpius. Again, Alistair was talking about this, and this is incredibly important stuff. But the soul doesn't stop there. It goes to, let's say, Pleiades or Orion, and that's the first portal. And once it goes through that portal, it's on the Milky Way, which is either a road or river, that then takes you up to the central point, the summit of the Milky Way, where it splits in two. And as we've already mentioned, what marks that, it's the Cygnus Constellation. And this was seen as a point of entry and exit into the sky world. And this is, as I said, in Native American tradition, but it's in various other places around the world, including, as my colleague Graham Hancock wrote in his most recent book, in Egypt as well, although he acknowledges myself and my colleague Greg Little for having worked on this beforehand, because it's there during the Pyramid Age. It was believed that, and this is in the pyramid texts that go back to about 2350 BC and are arguably much, much older, is that the soul of the pharaoh, once it was dead, took on the role of the god Osiris. And it would then be projected, once it went through the underworld, it would be projected up into the sky where it would meet the god Sa. The god Sa would greet it like its own brother. Now, the god Sa is the constellation of Orion, so it's exactly the same portal as found in Native American tradition. But once the soul was greeted by Sa and his sister Sopdet, who is the star Sirius, the soul continued its journey along the Milky Way until it reached its mother. The mother of Osiris was Nuit, and she was the sky goddess, but she's also the representation of the Milky Way. And it was said that the pharaoh in his role as Osiris would then rejoin his mother and enter into a cosmic womb. And that cosmic womb was represented in the physical world as a pyramid, the tomb, the sarcophagus. All of those represented the symbolic womb of the goddess Nuit. And the womb of the goddess Nuit was the Cygnus Constellation. That was the final point of entry into the afterlife in ancient Egyptian tradition. Now, we obviously all know about the Orion correlation, the great work of Robert Bouval, but there's something else that you probably don't know. And that is that if you go to the southeast of the plateau at Giza, and you were there in 2500 BC, once the three pyramids had been completed, you would see the three basic wing stars of the constellation of Cygnus, and each one would set down perfectly into the apexes of those three pyramids. Now you see it again. Now this was worked out by my engineer friend Rodney Hale using a computer program he created himself using all the data to do with the plateau and the positions of everything down to within a meter per pixel related to the sky of 2500 BC. So this is not just drawing lines on, pyramids. This is absolutely been computer generated. But here's the thing: the three stars of the making up the wings of Cygnus also reflect the geographical position exactly of those three pyramids. As you can see here, the three stars, Gaina, Sadir, and Ruach, represent in exactly the same order as they set. You can then look down vertically on those three pyramids, and they are in exactly the same geographical positions as those 3 stars in the sky. In other words, the synchronization with those stars of Cygnus works not just in 1 dimension, but in 2 and possibly even in 3 dimensions. Now, so where did all this knowledge come from? And why was it so important? Well, basically, what I show in books like the Cygnus Key is that all of this knowledge that ended up in Egypt came originally from the area of Göbekli Tepe and the culture there, the pre-pottery Neolithic peoples there. And it entered Egypt as early as 8,000 BC and remained at a place called Helwan, where there are the same culture that was actually at Göbekli Tepe were actually there in Egypt, and then eventually it was used at the time of the Pyramid Age, all this knowledge again. But where did the knowledge come from at Göbekli Tepe? Well, the answer sounds boring, but it's not. And it's stone tool technology, what's known as blade tool production, using a process known as pressure flaking and pressure retouching. This is a very, very highly specialised way of tool manufactures. But the fact is, it's like a paper trail. I mean, these are what's known as trifacial blades. They were found at Göbekli Tepe and are currently in Şanlıurfa Museum. I mean, they're beautiful. And they're beautifully finished using what's known as pressure flaking, which I won't explain at the moment. And these can be traced back. It's almost like a paper trail, because they're certainly there at the time of Göbekli Tepe, but Michael Sorensen of the University of Copenhagen has traced their roots all the way from Southwest Asia and in Europe, going all the way back to the Urals. And what he says is that they originally come from the area of northern or central Mongolia, which may sound like a long way away at the moment, but wait till we get there. But what he said is that once it reached Europe, it was inherited by these people called the Swiderians. And the Swiderians are the people that I say were behind the building of Göbekli Tepe, certainly at its inception around 9,600 BC. They brought knowledge. This is how they were reconstructed for my book Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. And that these people were a shamanic tradition. They were very early traders, trading across hundreds of miles. They did some of the earliest mining, and they were incredibly influential people. And their place of origin was the western foothills of the Ural Mountains. And that they came from there and end up in places like Europe, but also in Southwest Asia and at places like Göbekli Tepe. And we've got direct evidence of this. An anthropologist and archaeologist by the name of Michael Zillin recently wrote a paper showing similarities between this incredible wooden totem pole or idol found at a place called Shigir in the Middle Urals with the artistic styles of Göbekli Tepe. Now, the Shigir idol was originally about 5.5 metres tall, which is about 18.5 feet. And it had a head at the top, but several other heads all the way down. And he's not the only one to have written this, that there seems to be a relationship between the contemporary peoples that existed in the Urals and what was going on at Göbekli Tepe at the same time. In other words, the prime movers responsible for the creation of Göbekli Tepe came originally from the area of the Urals, and almost certainly moved down into the area of Göbekli Tepe at a time at the very end of this Younger Dryas period, where things were still very unstable in the world, and that they entered into Göbekli Tepe, and some of these twin pillars in the centre, just as Alistair said, represent these survivors of the cataclysm, these twins, these hero twins. And I think that is very important and probably quite true. But what's interesting is that the peoples of the Urals on the eastern side in the area of what's today what they call the western, the transuros of western Siberia. The peoples known as the Khanty and the Mansi still manufacture these idols to this day, or certainly did until fairly recent times. You can see pictures of them here, and there's another picture of them there. And what these idols represent, they're either gods, deities, but they were used as protection. They would be set up on the side of roads or they would protect cemeteries. And they had multiple heads, exactly like the Shiger idol, which dates to 9,600 BC, the exact same age as Göbekli Tepe. But what's interesting is that these idols could represent a deity of these people who was known as the World Surveyor Man. The World Surveyor Man is the turning point. He's like a personification of the cosmic axis. And in that role, he represents what's known as the cosmocrator, the person, the controller of cosmic time, basically. But what's so interesting is that he was also represented as a bird, something representing like a goose. And this is really important because it brings us back to everything that was in Lascaux, the whole traditions to do with Cygnus and the swan, right the way across Europe, even down into Göbekli Tepe, where Cygnus is a vulture, because it represents this turning point. It's something that's going back to a much earlier age, a time when Cygnus actually did represent the turning point of the heavens around 15 to 16,000 BC, and arguably even earlier if there's an earlier precessional cycle involved. And I mentioned these tools. Well, they're like a paper trail. And as I said, they go all the way back to the Urals where the Shiger idol was, and that's now been linked with Göbekli Tepe. But you can follow that path even further towards the east, into the Altai Mountains of Siberia, and into what is today northern Mongolia. And in these areas, this blade production using pressure flaking starts around 45,000 years ago. And archaeologists, even within the past few weeks, there's been news stories that are saying that we inherited this particular type of stone tool manufacture from peoples who were already around. We'll talk about them in a minute. But one of the locations that this type of tool manufacture begins is somewhere called the Denisova Cave. And these are the actual items that were found there. Now, the Denisova Cave, it's in southern Siberia, 22 levels, started in the 1970s excavations, goes back to 280,000 years ago. But it's layer 11 that we're interested in. It's known as the Denisovan Layer. It goes from circa about 70 to 40,000 years ago. And in here, some very, very important and interesting things have been discovered, including a tiny finger bone. And it was seen to be human-like in appearance, and it was sent off to be DNA sequenced. And the Max Planck Institute of Physical Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, did the work in 2010 and refined it in 2012, getting the genome of this particular individual. And they found that it belonged to no known individual in the modern human race. And it wasn't Neanderthal either. It was something brand new, something that they came to refer to as Denisovans. Okay? We didn't know anything about these people. We didn't know they even could possibly exist up until the year 2010. So who the hell are the Denisovans? Well, just in simple terms, they have close links with the Neanderthals. And they would seem to have been a part of the same strain, away from what's known as the common ancestor, with the Neanderthals before splitting very quickly and going their own way. So what this allowed is Homo sapiens, that's us, Neanderthals and Denisovans, all to develop their own genome, their own mindset, their own material culture, their own course through prehistory. And all of them are different. Neanderthals basically occupied Europe and Asia up to Central Asia. The Denisovans, as we'll see next, occupied mostly from Central Asia right eastward into Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Ireland, Southeast Asia, Australia, or certainly that is information that comes from DNA, because there are many modern human populations around the world that still have DNA that we can now tell comes specifically from the Denisovans, anything up to 5 to 6%. But you will notice on this map, you can see the Denisova Cave and one other site that we've got bones from, which we'll come to in a minute, that there's nothing in Africa, there's nothing in Europe. This is because what happened was that we come out of Africa, we go through Southwest Asia, and those that go to the west encounter the Neanderthals. They have sex with them, the Neanderthals die out, but we carry their legacy with us. Those that went to the east encountered eventually the Denisovans, and we interbred with them, they die out, and we continue their legacy, their ancestry. And that's why almost all of the circles there that represent the populations with Denisovan DNA are all in either Eastern Asia, Russian Far East, or in Southeast Asia or Australia, is because that represents our migrations to the furthest eastern point. Now, all of the fossils of Denisovans we can actually put into two hands at the moment. There's hardly any. But we can learn so much from DNA and so much from the tiny fragments that we've got so far, which include three molars, two of which you can see here, which are very large size. We'll come on to those. There's the finger bone that I mentioned at the top left. All of those were found in the Denisova Cave. But in 1980, a monk inside a cave called Bashiaya, which is near Zahi, which is in northwest China, right on the edge of the Tibetan plateau, discovered half of a jawbone. And he had the sense to take it to his lama, and the lama took it to the local university, and they kept it through until the present day. And only recently it's been confirmed that it is Denisovan. So this has given us incredible amount of knowledge and information about the jawbones and the appearance of the Denisovans. And we also confirms to us that they weren't just in Siberia, but they were quite clearly on the Tibetan plateau as well. And this is very interesting because one of the genes that was passed on to the indigenous peoples of the Tibetan plateau and the Himalayas was a high altitude gene called EPAS1. And this allows us and the Denisovans, because it seems as if we gained it from them, to live in extremely high altitudes where the oxygen is very, very thin. And it also confirms something else, because hundreds, if not thousands of tools were discovered at a site on the Tibetan plateau that date to about 30,000 years ago. This was 20,000 years earlier than modern humans were thought to have reached the Tibetan plateau. And it was suspected that they could relate to Denisovans because very similar tools, these blade tools which I've been talking about, were found in the Denisova Cave. Well, now with the discovery of the Denisovan jawbone in the same region, it now almost certainly means that that's true. Now, before we go any further, when were the Denisovans around? When did they die out? Well, it seems as if they probably came into existence in their own right about 400,000 years ago. And they probably continued on through till about 40 to 45,000 years ago. And that coincides at the same time that we probably encountered them. However, some DNA evidence from places like the Philippines and Indonesia suggests that some of them could have hung on until at least 15,000 years ago. That's really quite recent in human history. But what did the Denisovans actually look like? Well, we know that the molars were huge. I mean, you know, here's one of them here next to an anatomical modern human jawbone. They're virtually twice the size. And when one of them was discovered, it was so large they thought that it was that of a cave bear. But no, it was that of a Denisovan. And Bence Viola, a paleoanthropologist with the University of Toronto, said that this must have come from a rather big individual, somebody you would not want to meet on a cold, dark night, basically. And this is very interesting because 2 fragments of a Denisovan skull were recently discovered inside the Denisova Cave. They don't look very exciting to us, but what's so interesting is that Svante Pääbo, he's the main paleogeneticist that's been behind all of the sequencing of the bones of the Denisovans, said in relationship to this skull, the Denisovans, seem to have been very large and robust, even compared to Neanderthals, adding that in size and appearance, they were probably pretty impressive. So this is giving us an idea that these guys were not about that high, okay? And what's interesting is that genetically, the Denisovans are linked with an earlier type of what's known as a hominin, in other words, those of the human species, called Homo heidelbergensis. The DNA evidence seems to link this. And when found in South Africa, Homo heidelbergensis is regularly 7 feet in height. Now, this strongly suggests to me that the Denisovans were huge guys, and they look something like this. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that every Denisovan looked like that, but some of them may well have done. Now, this is a WWE wrestler. His name is the Great Khali, and you can look him up online. He's 7 feet tall in height, but I think there's a strong possibility that they are the giants of legend. What about their technology and advanced human behaviour of the Denisovans? Many of you will have seen this before. This is what's known today as the Denisovan Bracelet. This gives you an example of how advanced these people were and why they're so important to us. There are 2 fragments, have obviously been put back together, made of a green stone known as chloritolite. It's a form of chlorite. Beautiful, changes colour in natural and artificial light. It's at least 45 to 50,000 years ago. It's found in the Denisovan Layer in the Denisova Cave. And this is probably how it was worn. There is a hole in it. And this is something you should bear in mind with what obviously Chris Dunn said about obviously that the technologies that eventually end up becoming the mainstay in Egypt, is that there's a hole that, when looked at under a microscope, has a feed rate for a drill that's so fast it's comparable to a modern day drill. Now, this does not mean they had electric drills, don't worry. But what it does mean is that the Denisovans worked out how to create fast spinning drills, at least by 45 to 50,000 years ago. And I find that incredible. The oldest needle in the world was found in the Denisovan Layer. In fact, not one, there's about at least 2 or 3. And what this tells us is that the Denisovans wore tailored clothing. And this is the oldest needle in the world. There's even a chance that they rode around on horses. The finding of DNA of horses, horse bones inside the Denisova Cave has suggested to some that the Denisovans domesticated and even rode horses. Work is continuing at the Denisova Cave and more stuff's coming out all the time. A tiara came out in 2018, so-called, almost like an Alice band if you want. I think it's more a shaman's headband, like you see here and what Siberian shamans would wear. They have things decorating from it. And a ochre pencil was found in the same layer that had been used. So what were they using pencils for? Yes, they might have been decorating the body. Yes, they might have been creating cave art, but they could also have been inscribing symbols and possibly even glyphs. And the oldest bone flute stroke whistle in the world was found in the Denisova Layer. So it looks very likely that the Denisovans had a knowledge and understanding of music and how to replicate it and how to create notes. Now, we don't know exactly what this was made of because the source unfortunately doesn't say, but the chances are, because of others that have been found in the same area, that it was made of either swan or goose bone. Some of the earliest flutes in the world are made of swan bone, and there are legends to connecting swans with the creation of swan bones that remain in Europe to this day. I talk about this in my books. In other words, there's a relation, there's an importance in the use of a swan or a goose bone. Remember everything I've said to do with Cygnus and the birds, the migration, and this seems to be important because in the very area of the Denisova Cave and out right across the region are swan maiden traditions. And what this is the idea that a swan maiden comes down with her sisters from what's known as birdland, from the sky, comes down, wants to swim as mortals in a lake. They take off their swan thrift or coat, put it at the side of a lake, and some hunter comes along, steals the coat of one of them, forcing her to remain as a mortal. He marries her, they have children, she eventually tricks him or finds her swan garment and is able to escape back to birdland. But the tribes and clans all over Mongolia, Siberia, Central Asia all claim descendancy from swan maidens. And this is really important, I think, because I think that this relates not just to a time frame, probably going back as much as 45,000 years, but also to a connection with the swan shamanism that may well have been inherited, I say, from the Denisovans. Because what really happened when we first encountered them, we obviously don't know, but what we can tell is where all this happened. This is one of the illustrations from my book, Denisovan Origins. It's what we call the Denisovan line. It's the line that our ancestors would have first encountered the Denisovans. And anything beyond, as you can see, all of the circles are where modern populations are with Denisovan DNA today. And so somewhere along there, that's where we encountered them. But having said that, archaeologists only again within the past few weeks are suggesting that one of the places we first encounter the Denisovans is northern Mongolia, just to the south of a huge inland sea called Lake Baikal. And this is the path you can see here that our ancestors took from Africa through Southwest Asia, through Central Asia, and finally they reached Mongolia. And this is the very area that this blade tool technology using pressure flaking was created for the first time. And the archaeologists are now beginning to say, well, I've said in my books, and that's the fact that this technology, this stone tool technology came from the Denisovans. I think that that's absolutely correct. These guys were so advanced, incredibly advanced, that I think we have to start looking at the possibility that they handed us the rudiments of what would later become civilization itself. And one of the sites involved here is a place called Tolbar, which you can see ringed here. But very close, well, I say close, I wouldn't like to walk it, is a place called Malta. This is nothing to do with Malta, obviously, in the Mediterranean, but it's basically the same name. And this is a very, very important, incredible site. It's to the west of Lake Baikal. And archaeologists working there over many decades have found lots of incredible, really advanced artifacts dating back about 24,000 years, including a large number of swan pendants. And the archaeologist involved with working at Malta wrote about them, and what he said was that at least 4 of them, possibly more, when discovered, were all orientated north-south, and that this seemed to have a symbolic importance. And that he said that this was connected with the soul's flight as a bird. This is 24,000 years ago. And the north-south passage of migrating birds, which we've been talking about. And the earliest manifestation of animism in Siberia. Now, animism is the idea of transforming into an animal form to achieve things in the invisible world, usually by adorning yourself in the paraphernalia of the particular animal or bird that you are connected with, your spirit animal, if you like. And it would seem as if one of the most important ones at this time was the swan. So no wonder all of this swan ancestry is important there. And coming into Europe, as I said, the connection between the swan, the Milky Way, the migrating birds, was personified as this female form, this female goddess, this cosmic mother, if you like, who has various names. And it would seem to be that her place in the sky was the Cygnus Constellation, the very place that was seen as the point of entrance and exit into the sky world. Now, what's also been found at Malta is something very extraordinary. We call it the Malta Plate. It's mammoth bone, and on one side there are 3 snakes, which is interesting as there was no snakes in the region of Malta in Siberia at that time. But more interesting than that is the fact that there are a series of packed spirals on the other side with a whole circle in the centre. And a Russian archaeologist by the name of Antony Larachev worked out that the number in each of the spirals represented numbers associated with cycles of the sun and the moon and eclipse cycles. And this is 24,000 years ago, and that these numbers are numbers which end up becoming very familiar in architecture, literature, and cyclic time, particularly in the very areas where all the Denisovan hybrids end up creating the modern populations. Numbers like 54, 72, 108, 216, 432, and multiples thereof. I mean, obviously in Indian, Hindu Vedic tradition, there is the yugas, the kalpas, which go into not just millions of years, but billions of years in length. And all of them are multiples of these numbers, particularly 432. 432 is found in Chinese tradition to do with cycles of time as well. It's there in sacred architecture like Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom in Cambodia, and Borobudur, the Buddhist complex in Java. There's 432 separate stupas with Buddhas inside. And that number is repeated again and again and again. So where did these numbers come from, and why do they exist? Well, as I show in the book The Cygnus Key, and again in the new book Denisovan Origins, all of these numbers are generated through an intricate knowledge of the synchronization of 2 specific traditions. One is to do with the triple Saros eclipse cycle. The other is the precession. Every 72 years, the sun moves 1 degree in a precessional cycle. It's a combination of those. That was it. Just out of interest. You can see this in my book. We've got 5 minutes, so the key to all of this is autism and savant qualities, that we think that the Denisovans had a savant mindset. And that therefore they advanced much quicker than their rivals, the Neanderthals. They had a deep sense of connection with the cosmic origins. And what did they really look like? Well, they found only recently the other part of that finger bone, right? It was away in some laboratory in America. It's now been examined. And the important thing is they found that it looks very similar to a modern human finger bone, not to like a Neanderthal, which they expected, because there was closer genetic links between the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. And that and further work recently by the Hebrew University of Israel, created through the genetics, the genes and proteins, whatever, an image of what they believe the Denisovans look like, and that's it. This was only released in the last couple of weeks. However, this has been criticised massively by a lot of people, saying, you know, you really are clutching at straws to be able to create this. And I think that this beautiful piece of art here show somebody that looks far, far too human, I'm afraid. I've been working with an artist by the name of George Hernandez, who lives in California, to try and use every piece of evidence that we can as to what the Neanderthals, sorry, the Denisovans look like, and we think they look more like this. Okay? All of the evidence seems to suggest that that is what a Denisovan would have looked like. Now, okay, he looks a little bit scary, I know, but these were troubled times. You had saber-toothed tigers after you every day, and there were ice ages, and lots of people probably rivaling for the same territories. He's got every right to look pissed off. So, but these guys were very, very, very clever and very, very intelligent, and they may well have had savant-like minds, or certainly some of them, and to be classed almost on the autistic spectrum as they would be today. But putting a spanner in the works of everything is this story that comes out of the last week, and I've written an article all about this, is that evidence of swan shamanism and animism has been found in Israel with a bone that's been cut to remove feathers that goes back 420,000 years. Okay? This is just before the Denisovans really come into existence. And the researchers who've done a paper on this, one of them, Ran Barkay, says in an article just this week, it was apparently for cosmological or ritual purposes that these bones were used. It was just one swan bone, loads of other bones of other animals, but just one swan bone, which they see as significant. Maybe the thought that with the help of feathers they could gain the swan's characteristics. This is the foundations of animism and shamanism. Shamanism exists in all groups too. So does rock art. Altered states of consciousness exist in all groups and always relate to their relationship with the world. In other words, this is the root of shamanism, much, much earlier. But what's so interesting is that in the same cave that this was found, a place called Kezem, near Tel Aviv, is that they found in the same layer teeth and part of a jawbone that looked like modern humans. But we now know that the Denisovans look like modern humans as well, closer to us than they do the Neanderthals. And it's beginning to throw up ideas that the Denisovans could have been closer to us than what we actually realise. Not us, but some kind of parallel branch of modern humans that somehow died out, but that had incredible knowledge, incredible intelligence, and just may, somewhere on this planet, have created their own civilization before completely disappearing. So in other words, there's a link with us, with them. Very, very important. And somehow it all ends up here at Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BC, and here in Egypt during the Pyramid Age around 2500 BC. And that's the story of it. Thank you very much. And sorry, can we have my books back, please? Right, yeah, sorry, this is the advert bit. Right, this is the new book, Denisovan Origins, written with my colleague Greg Little. The Cygnus Key has a lot more of this stuff in that came out in 2018. Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the God, been bestseller all around the world. But just don't mention it if you go to Göbekli Tepe. You'll get thrown out. I'm now banned from Turkey. Some of you probably know that now. And it was all because of this book, From the Ashes of Angels, which was written at the same time that the first spades were going into the ground at Göbekli Tepe, preempting its discovery. That book's now banned in Turkey, and they're currently destroying every copy of it. But I'm not banned from Egypt. So if you want to come on a tour to Egypt with us, February next year with Ancient Origins website, I'll happily see you there. And that's me, Andrew Collins. If you want to know anything more about my world, andrewcollins.com, and find me on the usual social media. Thank you very much. That's another lecture we won't do today. Okay.
So go to the book room right away, buy the book before it's banned in Boston.